The space market of Varnock Station was loud and full of smells and colors and pain and shouting and metal walls that never stopped buzzing with power and fear. Hundreds of cages lined the walls and floors and ceilings, and inside those cages were beings from many worlds with faces full of sorrow and skin marked with chains and wires and shock burns. But one cage was different. In that cage sat a girl with silver skin and pale hair like starlight and eyes sharp like broken glass. She did not cry and she did not speak and she did not beg like the others did. She just sat with her back straight and her hands on her knees and her eyes staring forward. She had no name and no family and no voice and no hope. Her number was 47B, and that was all anyone called her since the day she was taken from the ashes of her ruined homeworld. People passed her cage and whispered things and laughed, and some stared too long, and some looked afraid, and some looked afraid, and some looked hungry, but no one stopped until a human did. He was tall and rough, and wore a long dark coat with scars on his face, and dust on his boots, and a strange look in his eyes like fire, and calm at the same time. He stood before her cage, and tilted his head like he was thinking, and she flinched. For the first time in many days, she thought he might be another cruel buyer, or worse, someone who liked to hurt slaves before buying them. But the human said nothing. He just looked at her for a long time while the seller kept talking and bragging and offering a discount. Finally, the human spoke, and his voice was calm and deep and soft in a way. She was not used to how much for her, he asked, and the seller grinned and told him she was expensive and dangerous and not good for pleasure use, but maybe useful for rare tasks. The human paid without asking more, and the seller laughed and opened the cage and said she was all his now. She did not move. She waited for the new collar or the chain or the command to kneel or crawl or obey, but the human did not offer chains. He held the cage door open and said 4 words she had never heard before. "You can walk free." She stared at him, thinking it was a trick or a test or a game, because nothing was ever free and kindness was always fake. She stepped out slowly and watched him closely, and he just turned and walked toward the docking bay, like she was meant to follow if she wanted. She followed because she had nowhere else to go, and because part of her wanted to see how the trick would end. His ship was small and strong, with a dented hull and paint that had faded from many stars in battle. She let her walk in without guards and without orders, and showed her a room and said, "This is your space and you can rest, and if you need anything, just ask." She stood in the middle of the room while he walked away. She touched the soft bed and the clean clothes folded on a chair and the small light that turned on with a touch, and it felt strange, like a story or a lie. Later, he brought food and placed it on a table and said it was safe and warm, and he would leave it there should he did not eat. She sat in the corner and watched the door and waited for the night to turn into pain and orders and screams. But the night stayed quiet. The next day, the human returned and asked if she had a name, and she said nothing, and he said, "All right, I will call you Lysera for now, unless you tell me your true name." Lysera. She repeated the name in her mind, and it sounded soft and cold, like water on metal. She wondered why he chose it and what it meant, but she did not ask. He showed her how to use the translator so they could speak and understand each other without guessing. He gave her a simple tunic and said she did not have to wear slave clothes anymore, and she could choose her look. She nodded, but still wore the old cloth, because the new one felt too clean and too soft and not real. She watched him work on the ship and talk to other crew members who did not seem to fear him and did not stare at her like she was Lessie, treated them like equals, and they laughed with him and sometimes called him Captain Cole. She heard them call her the Quiet One and the Ghost Girl and the Silver Shadow. She stayed quiet, but one night she heard laughter in the hallway, and she moved close to listen. It was him telling a story about a battle, and the others laughing like family, and she felt something strange in her chest. It was not fear, and it was not pain. It was something else, something she could not name. She looked out the window and saw stars passing like rivers, and she whispered her new name. Lyserash did not know if she liked it yet, but she knew it was hers, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe this ship could be something more than a cage with different bars. Maybe this time she was not owned. Lysera stood in the center of the ship, like a shadow that did not know where to go, or what to be, or how to feel. The walls were smooth, and the lights were soft, and the air was clean, but she felt like she was still in a cage, just one without bars. He watched Cole as he moved through the ship, fixing wires, checking screens, speaking to the crew with calm words and quiet strength. He smiled sometimes, not at her, but at others, and she did not know what to do with that smile, because no one ever smiled near her, unless they wanted something. When he brought her food again, he did not speak much. He simply nodded and placed it down and left the room, like she was not a thing. But A person who needed space. She stared at the food for a long time. Her stomach hurt, but her mind screamed louder. What if it was poisoned? What if eating made her slow? What if he was waiting to see if she obeyed? She pushed the plate away and curled up on the floor because the bed felt like a trap, like something too soft to trust. She slept for a few minutes, then woke up from dreams of collars and fire and cold hands, pulling her into dark rooms. The next morning, Cole came in and looked at the untouched food in her tired eyes and said, "You do not have to be afraid here. Not from me, not from anyone on this ship." She looked at him, but said nothing. He sat on the floor across from her and took a piece of the food and ate it in front of her and smiled again. "See," he said, "it is just food." She watched him chew and swallow and sit there like it was the most normal thing in the galaxies. Slowly she reached out and took a small bite, and her hands trembled, and her teeth hurt, and her eyes watered. But she chewed and swallowed. The taste was strange, not sweet, not bitter, just warm and real. He stood up and said, "You are stronger than you think," and then he left that night. She did not sleep on the floor. She sat on the bed, but did not close her eyes. For long she listened to the hum of the ship, and the quiet voices of the crew, and waited for screams that never came. She still flinched at every sudden sound, and turned sharply at every open door, but the doors never slammed, and the voices never shouted, and the hands never grabbed. One day Cole asked her if she wanted to learn how to open the navigation panel. She said nothing, but followed him, and watched as he pointed at the glowing screen, and moved his fingers to shift the map of the stars. He said, "This is where we are, and this is where we are going, and one day you can choose a place too." She looked at the stars, and felt very small, but also something else, something like maybe she was not lost forever. Another day he gave her a small bracelet with a button and said, "Press this if you are ever afraid or in danger, and I will come to you." She held the bracelet and did not understand why anyone would come just because she pressed a button. She did not wear it at first. She kept it under her pillow like a secret. Later she saw it and put it on, because maybe it meant something, and maybe she was allowed to hope. One evening she saw a reflection of herself in the ship window, and she stopped and stared. She saw the silver skin, and the strange eyes, and a face that once only knew pain, but now she also saw something new. Not a slave, not a weapon, not a number, just a girl trying to breathe. Cole spoke to her gently and never asked for anything. Not her past, not her loyalty, not her body. He let her sit in silence, and gave her books with pictures, and let her listen to music she did not understand, but wanted to. Night she walked through the ship, and saw the stars outside the window, and said the name he gave her out loud again. Felt strange, but not wrong. Then she whispered, "I belong to no one." And for a second her chest felt light. She did not trust it, not yet, but she kept the words close. Past other crew members who nodded at her or smiled, and some even spoke a few kind words. She answered with small nods and soft sounds, and sometimes even a thank you, in a voice that barely sounded like hers. But the fear was still there. The fear that this would all end, that someone would come and pull her away and chain her again, that Cole would reveal his true reason, and she would fall into the same darkness as before. So one night she tried to run. She crept to the docking door and touched the panel, and it opened without a lock or alarm or command code on. That scared her more than anything, because freedom that easy must be a lie. She stepped out and looked into the spaceport tunnels, and saw shadows moving. Then she saw him, a tall figure, with a cruel smile and sharp teeth, and eyes that glowed red. He looked straight at her, and said, "So, the little royal pet is still alive." The voice felt like ice sliding into her bones, and the sound of it made Lysera freeze where she stood, because that voice knew her past and her blood, and her fear. She turned slowly, and saw him step into the light of the hallway, a tall alien man, with armor that glowed faint red, and eyes that burned like dying stars. He smiled in a way that showed no warmth, only hunger. He said her name, not the one Cole gave her, but the true one, the royal one, the one no one should know. Lysera said nothing. Her breath caught in her throat, and her body screamed to run, but her legs stayed still like stone. "You thought you were safe," he said, "but they never stopped hunting you then." He took one step closer, and her body reacted at last. She turned and ran back into the ship, through the doors that opened without resistance, and down the hall toward the engine room, where she knew Cole would be. She almost crashed into him, and when he saw her face, he asked what happened. She could not speak, just grabbed his arm and pointed back. The warning lights turned red, and the alarm began to hum, and Cole looked at the screen and saw the intruder inside the ship. His eyes narrowed, and he pulled a weapon from his belt, and told her to stay behind him, but she did not listen. The enemy moved fast and slammed into Cole, like a beast with power beyond normal limits, and they both fell to the floor in a blur of fists and shouts. Lysera watched for one heartbeat too long, then picked up a pipe and swung it into the enemy's back he roared in pain and turned on her, and for a moment she thought he would kill her then and there, but Cole used the opening to strike hard and fast, and the intruder stumbled backward and vanished into the smoke of a thrown flash bomb. They chased him, but he was gone. The ship was clear again, but Cole looked at Lysera with new questions in his eyes. Who was that? Cole asked, and how did he know your name? She wanted to lie, but her hands were shaking, and her chest hurt with guilt and fear and old wounds, so she told him. She told him her true name, her true past, her true bloodline. She said, I was born in the royal houses of Var Saren. Before the war, before the fall, before the purging. She said my people were rulers and warriors, but also builders and thinkers, and when the war ended, they were hunted because no empire wanted their return. She said I was a child when they came, they killed everyone they found, but someone hid me, and later smugglers sold mesh. Said the bounty on my head is still active, and many would kill just to bring my body to those who want my blood. Erased. Cole listened without interrupting, and when she finished she looked down, waiting for anger or fear or rejection. But he said nothing for a moment, then said, You are not your bloodline, and you are not your past, and you are not alone. Now she looked up and saw no fear in his eyes, only that same strange fire and calm. He said, They may come, but they will not take you. He said, I will not let them. Lysera felt her knees go weak, not from fear, but from something else. She whispered, You do not understand. They will keep coming, they will send more, and they will not stop. Cole said then, We will not run, we will make them stop. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a data drive and handed it to her. He said, This contains records of old safe zones, old allies, people who once worked in the shadows to protect those who were hunted like you. He said, Maybe they can help us, or maybe they know what else is coming. She took the drive and felt its weight like a memory that might matter again later. She sat in her room and looked at her reflection, and said her true name out loud, and then said it again, and then whispered, Lysera, and felt the two names meet inside her. Like fire and water that night, she could not sleep, so she walked the halls of the ship and thought about the man who had found her, and the way he looked at her, not like a tool or a threat or a symbol, but like a person. She thought about the way he fought for her, and how he did not run when he learned the truth. She thought about her people, and the ones who had died, and the ones who might still be hiding, and the ones who might be like her, scared, alone, hunted. She did not want to be a ghost anymore. She wanted to live, and to fight, and to stand. She wanted to find the others, and maybe find her space. The ship moved through the stars. She sat by the window and held the bracelet he gave her in one hand, and the data drive in the other. Stars passed like silent watchers, and Lysera whispered to them, I am not just a name, I am not just a memory, I am still here, and I am not done. Asterisk. The ship moved through deep space while Lysera sat in silence near the observation glass, watching the stars drift like slow fireflies across the black sea. Light reminded her of a place she would never see again, and some lights looked like faces she once knew but now could not remember clearly. Her mind still held chains, even though her wrists did not, and every corner of freedom felt sharp and strange, and to Big Butt, Cole never pushed her. He gave her room to think, to heal, to speak, or stay quiet. He brought her warm food and shared old stories, and never once asked her for anything. One day he brought a small plant in a metal pot and placed it on the table in her room. He said, This one is tough, it lived through 4 engine fires and a crash, and it still grows, so I thought you might like it. She looked at the small green leaves and felt a strange warmth in her chest, like something soft waking up later. He gave her a small data pad full of pictures and lessons. It showed the stars and the names of planets and the stories of people who changed their fate. He said, Read if you want, or draw, or just listen to the music. She tried reading slowly at first, and the words felt heavy, but soon she could follow the sentences, and even laugh at one short story about a thief and a robot Gotha. Laughter surprised her. She put her hand over her mouth as if the sound was a mistake, but it was already there, and Cole had heard it and smiled without turning around. Then one morning she woke early and walked into the main control room and sat near the front window. Cole came in with 2 hot mugs and gave her one without speaking, and they watched a solar flare dance across a nearby sit. Toshi whispered, Thank you not just for the drink, but for the space and the quiet and the small kindness that built like drops in a well. That day he showed her the star maps and how to trace a course from one system to another. She listened closely and asked questions and even made a few corrections. That surprised him. He looked at her with raised brows and said, You are sharper than most pilots. I know, and she smiled a little and looked away. Over the next days, she helped with small tasks, checking wires, cleaning parts, learning how the engines worked, and how to patch hull cracks with bonding foam. The crew began to nod at her more, and a few even spoke full greetings with friendly tones. A small, alien engineer named Dox gave her a charm made of broken bolt pieces, and said it was for luck. She took it carefully, and wore it around her neck, and said thank you, with a voice that did not shake. This time one evening she sat in the mess hall with the crew, and listened to them joke about past missions and strange cargo. Cole told a story about a bounty job, where he had to pretend to be a dancer to get close to the target, and everyone laughed, and clapped when he mimicked the dance even. Lysera laughed and covered her mouth again, but this time, Cole pointed and said, "No hiding it, you have a beautiful laugh," and everyone nodded. Her cheeks warmed, and she looked down, but her heart felt less heavy. After the crew left, she stayed behind and looked at her reflection in the window, and she saw the girl with silver skin and sharp eyes, but now she also saw a spark, a softness, a beginning. She whispered, "I am learning to breathe." The words felt strange but truther. Next day they landed on a quiet moon station to resupply, and Cole offered to walk with her outside. She wore a cloak to hide her face and followed him through the market, where people sold tools and food and shiny stones. With glowing crochet felt eyes on her, but not the same kind as before, not cruel, not greedy, just curious. Cole bought a small carved bird, made of skyglass, and gave it to her. He said it reminded him of her, not because it looked like her, but because it looked free. She held it tightly, and said, "I do not know what freedom feels like." And he said, "That is all right. Most people do not know until they almost lose it." The way back to the ship, she paused and looked at the sky. There were 2 suns above and soft clouds below, and she whispered, "I want to live." Cole looked at her and said, "Then, we will make sure you do that." Night she sat in her room and placed the bird on her shelf, beside the plant and the lucky charm, and the bracelet. Each item was small, but together they told a new story, one she had never imagined she could live. A story not of chains but of choices. She lay on the bed and let her eyes close slowly, without fear, and for the first time her dreams did not begin in fire. The stars outside the ship had turned red, with warning, as Lysera stood in the main control room, staring at the screen that showed an unknown vessel, closing in with no identification and no signal. Just silence, and speed. Cole narrowed his eyes, and said, "Prepare for trouble," but even he did not know what was coming. The ship was sleek and black, like a blade, and moved without sound, through space like a predator that had already chosen its prey. When it reached them, the ship did not fire, but sent a signal, a single voice message that cut through the air like ice. "Hello, cousin," it said. Lysera froze, and her heart thudded hard against her ribs, and her knees nearly gave out because she knew that voice, even though it had changed with time and hatred. She whispered his name, and Cole looked at her with quiet alarm. "That is your cousin?" he asked. She nodded slowly, and said, "He was thought dead long ago. During the purging, he was older than me, and stronger and cruel. Even back then," the voice continued over the ship's comes, saying, "You are not hiding well, Lysera, and the blood in your veins still belongs to the throne, and to the war we must finish." Cole answered sharply over the channel, and said, "She is not yours, and she is not property, and this conversation is over." But the cousin only laughed a low, cold sound, and said, "Then, I will come take what is mine." The connection ended, and for a moment, the ship was quiet, except for the hum of power in the walls, and the sound of Lysera's breath catching in her throat. She turned to Cole and said, "He will not stop. He wants the bloodline to rise again, and he sees me as a tool, or a threat, nothing else." Cole said then, "We will fight if we must, but we will not run, not any more." The crew prepared for battle, locking systems and raising shields, and readying weapons, but the black ship did not fire, and instead sent a small pod toward them, silent and smooth. Cole ordered it brought aboard into the cargo bay. Under guard, Lysera followed him there, with her heart full of fire and fear, and when the pod opened, a figure stepped out, tall and armored, with a helmet that hid his face. He removed it slowly, and there he was, older now, with scarred cheeks and eyes like mirrors full of war and memory. He smiled at Lysera like a snake smiles at its prey, and said, "You are not as broken as I thought, but I will fix that." She stood her ground and said, "I am not yours, and never will be, and I would rather die than return to the throne of chains." He laughed again and said, "You still think like a child. This galaxy does not care for your dreams. It only listens to power, and I have gathered much." He looked at Cole with cold calculation and said, "And you human, you have no idea what this girl truly is. She is not just a royal, she is the last bearer of the flame, and with her I could rebuild what we lost." Cole stepped forward and said, "She is not a tool or a symbol, she is a person, and she decides her own fate." The cousin's smile faded, and he said then, "You are both fools, and when you burn you will know it was your choice." He left the pod and returned to his ship, and vanished into deep space without another word. But everyone knew it was not over later. Lysera sat in her room with shaking hands and eyes that would Not classical entered quietly, and said you did well back there, you stood strong. She said I do not feel strong, I feel like I am falling and there is no ground. Cole said then fall into something real, fall into your truth, not your fear. She looked at him and said, what if my truth brings death to everyone near me? He said then we face it together. He handed her a small cube, glowing with pale light, and said this holds ancient data we recovered from an old contact. It may show where the cousins' fleet is hiding, or where the last flame temples were. Buried. Lysera took the cube, and stared at it, and said I never asked for this, I just wanted to be Cole said maybe freedom means facing what they tried to bury, maybe freedom means choosing to rise. She held the cube tighter, and said then, I will choose, and I will not be his tool. The next day she walked into the control room, and said plot a course for the old ruins on planet Dayrun. They may hold answers, they may hold weapons or history, or hope. The crew followed her orders without question, and Cole smiled behind hers. The ship turned toward the unknown. She stood tall near the window, and said softly to herself, I am not a ghost, and I am not a puppet, and I will not be taken. She felt fear in her chest, but also fire, not the kind that burned cities, the kind that lit the dark asterisk. The wind on Dayrun was dry and sharp as blades, and the sky burned with two suns, while dust moved like ghosts across the valley floor, where the old flame temples had once stood in glory, now cracked and half buried in silence. Once Lysera walked across broken stone and shattered metal, reading symbols with her fingers and whispering names. Lost to time, her voice soft and full of wonder and weight. Cole followed behind her, scanning the area for threats, but also watching her move with purpose, like she had walked these paths before in dreams or memories that had waited deep in her blood. The crew spread out carefully, securing the area and setting up defenses, just in case the cousin returned sooner than expected. Inside the main temple chamber, Lysera found a hidden panel and pressed her hand against it, and the wall opened with a low hum, revealing a chamber full of light and data crystals still glowing. After all these years, she stepped inside, and the lights responded to her presence, rising slowly like stars waking from long sleep. Cole stepped in after her, his eyes wide with quiet awe, and said, what is this? She said, this is where the fire was kept, where our people stored the knowledge of the old ways, the secrets of peace and war and healing and power. He said, do you think your cousin is looking for this? She said, I know he is, but he cannot use it without the flame blood, and he does not carry it, not like I do. They spent hours copying files and scanning systems and unlocking hidden codes, some of which only responded to Lysera's voice. But outside in the dust, the cousin had already returned. His black ship came low and fast, and dropped cloaked soldiers across the ridge like shadows, with weapons drawn and orders given. They moved silently, and struck first at the outer guards, before alarms could sound. By the time the crew inside knew what was happening, half the team was already down. Cole grabbed his weapon, and told Lysera to stay behind, but she said no, not this time, not again. They ran through the temple halls, as blasts echoed and dust filled the air, and shadows moved fast between the broken walls. Suddenly one of the cousin's men appeared from behind, and hit Cole hard, sending him crashing into the stone. Lysera screamed and fought with everything she had, swinging a metal rod and striking the soldier's helmet until he fell. She turned to help Cole, but another soldier grabbed her from behind and pressed a shock rod to her neck. The world went black when she woke. Her hands were bound, and the air smelled like metal and fire, and the walls were dark, with red lights glowing above. She was on the cousin's ship again, and chains wrapped her wrists and her ankles, and the past had returned like a storm. Her cousin entered the room, his armor gleaming, and his eyes cold and full of victory. He said, you ran for so long, and played at freedom, but this was always your fate. You carry the blood, you carry the flame, you carry the key. She said, I carry choice, and I will never give you what you want. He struck her hard across the face, and said, you will not speak unless spoken to. She tasted blood, but lifted her chin, and stared at him with fire in her eyes. He said, the human is dead, or close to it, and his ship will burn soon, and no one is coming to save you. But, she said, he will come, and you will see. Elsewhere, Cole was not dead. He had crawled from the rubble with wounds across his face and fire in his chest and rage in his heart. He rallied what remained of the crew, and called in every old favor he had, and within hours, a warship answered his call, a beast of metal and fury and memory. He said, we are going to bring her back, and anyone who stands in our way will foul. The ship roared through space, chasing the signal of the cousin's vessel, like a hunter with locked eyes inside her cell. Lysera closed her eyes, and whispered his name over and over like a prayer or a weapon. The chains dug into her skin, but her spirit stayed strong, and her thoughts moved like fire through her blood. She remembered the stars she saw from Cole's ship, the music he let her hear, the laugh she had thought was lost, and The name he gave Hershey was Lysera, now not just a royal, not just a tool, and not a slaver. Cousin returned once more and said, "Soon we begin the ritual to unlock the flame, and you will obey." She smiled through blood and said, "You are all ready too." Late in then the ship shook hard, alarms screamed, and the lights turned red outside. Cole had arrived with fire in his hands and war in his eyes, and he had come for her. The enemy ship shook with fire as Cole's war cruiser struck from above its engines. Howling like beasts, the hull burning with the fury of a man who refused to let the stars steal what he loved inside. The dark prison Lysera raised her head as the lights flickered red and the floor tilted beneath her chains, singing with tension. Guards outside her door shouted in panic, and one ran to check the systems, only to fall silent as a blast ripped through the hallway and Cole stepped through. The smoky was covered in ash and blood and pain, but his eyes burned with light. And when they saw her, they softened with something deeper than words. He moved fast, cutting her chains without hesitation and catching her as she fell into his arms. Her legs weak, her body bruised, but her will unbroken. "I told you I would come," he whispered, and she said, "I knew you would." They ran through the burning holes, past fallen soldiers and broken machines, as the ship groaned like a dying beast, and behind them the cousin's voice echoed through the speakers, saying, "You cannot stop this, you cannot run from your blood, Cole." And Lysera reached the central core, where the cousin waited, surrounded by flame and shadow. His armor cracked, his eyes wild with rage. He said, "This is the end for you both. You could have ruled, but you chose ruin." Lysera stepped forward and said, "I did not choose ruin. I chose myself, and I chose life, and I chose love." The cousin raised his weapon, but Cole was faster. He moved like a storm, like a promise, and they clashed in the heart of the ship, with fire rising around them. Lysera did not run this time. She grabbed a fallen staff and struck when the moment was right, hitting the cousin's arm and knocking the weapon free. Took the chance and landed a blow that sent the cousin to his knees. He looked up at them, bleeding and snarling, and said, "She is still mine. Her blood is still mine." But Lysera stepped close and said, "I was never yours, and you will never touch me again." She took the staff and struck one final time, and the cousin fell into silence. The ship shook harder, now ready to fall apart, and Cole grabbed her hand and said, "We have to go now." They ran to the escape pod and launched just as the war cruiser pulled away, the enemy vessel exploding behind them, like a sun being born and dying at the same time. The pod drifted through quiet space for a moment, and in that silence, Lysera leaned her head on Cole's shoulder and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to feel safe. They returned to the cruiser, where the crew waited, cheering and crying, and calling her name not as a prisoner or a legend, but as a survivor and a leader. Later, when the wounds were treated and the fires put out, Cole took her to the garden chamber where the ship kept its green life safe and calm there. Among the leaves and the soft glow, he knelt and held out something small and simple, a ring of metal carved from the first bolt he found after he met her. He said, "I do not offer this as a master or a rescuer or a hero. I offer this as a man who sees you as his equal and wants to build a life with you, not above you, not behind you, but beside you." Lysera looked at the ring, and then at him, and for the first time in her life, she felt full, not with fear or duty, but with choice. She knelt with him, and took his hand and said, "Yes, stay." Did not need music or crowns or grand halls. The stars outside were enough, and the small garden heard their vowed. They married on the ship, surrounded by friends and stars, and quiet joy in her name echoed through the halls, not as a warning, but as a promise. Lysera, the flame bearer, the free one, the woman who walked through fire and chose to stand tall. She began to help others like her, those still hiding, those still hunted, those who had never heard the word equal in their lives. With Cole she built not a kingdom but a home where no chain could reach. And when people asked her who she was, she smiled and said, "I am no one's possession. I am no one's prisoner. I am Lysera. I belong to no one except by my choice."